So I just want to run through a few basic concepts in project planning, things that you can keep in mind as you begin to refine both the plan for your project, its design, as well as your plan for working this semester. We're going to cover a couple of things in this presentation. One is the factors that kinds of inputs that go into the creation of a project, how to formulate goals, and then other considerations. First, in planning your public history project, consider your end product, right? It's a narrative, a representation. It's ultimately a message or some kind of meaning making. And going into that creation of that message are multiple factors. For instance, we have visitor and audience interest, stakeholder investments, management needs. These might be everything from the available time, staffing, resources, in capacity of an organization, size of exhibit halls, web and digital infrastructure, and so forth, as well as maybe what board members and leadership need if you're thinking about this in a larger institutional context. And then finally, you have the resources that are at your command, the collections, the community resources, oral histories, the voices. All of these go into the creation of the end product, and you need to keep all of these in mind as you work to define the scope and strategy of your project. Your project goals should articulate what you want to accomplish with that message and how it serves all of the above. Goals can include things like to enhance public understanding of a specific subject matter, teach specific skills, raise public awareness, or communicate certain values or meanings, to motivate critical thinking or reflection. This is something that we often see in public history. To showcase something like community voices, artwork, or maybe a particular collection. Or to encourage specific partnerships or collaborations in or between communities. This is often the case in institutional contexts where there's a certain agenda for community engagement, or perhaps there's a specific partner or other institution that you're collaborating with. And part of the goal of the project is to encourage that partnership. Often goals can be both internal and external. So encouraging a specific partnership or building up a specific capacity is often an internal goal, whereas an external goal would be more public-oriented or involve specific learning objectives. There's a cute little formula you can use. Project goals should always be SMART. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and time-framed. The first two are very, very important no matter what the project is. You want to be very specific about what your project's going to accomplish. You want to use active verbs. You want to specify a specific kind of outcome. But also, they need to be measurable, and this also relates to realistic. They have to be achievable, and you have to be able to show in some way that you've achieved what you have done, whether it's quantitatively or qualitatively, and we'll definitely be going into this later in the semester. Especially if you're involving stakeholders or other kinds of collaborators, they should also be agreed upon. In a specific project context, they should be agreed upon by the project team, or even in the case of an oral history project, the goals should be agreed upon between interviewers and narrators. And then finally, time framed. All projects have some sort of deadline or specific time frame in which they have to happen, so your project goals should reflect that time frame and should be doable within that time frame. How do you build project goals? Well, project goals should always flow from the project mission. So the first thing you want to do is create a mission statement for your project. What are you doing and why? This could be 1 or 2 sentences. Again, it should be very actively voiced and very specific. And then from that, are you going to realize that mission? What are the key components of the project? What's the link between the program components and its larger mission, right? And this will help you understand what your goals are. So what are you doing and why? And then specifically within that mission, what are your larger goals? And then finally, you establish objectives that will realize these goals. Now, a lot of times this language is often used interchangeably. For the purposes of this presentation and for this class, we're thinking of this as a kind of a larger hierarchy. Mission is your broadest statement of what you're doing. Goals are the larger things, outcomes that you're trying to achieve, or not outcomes, but your larger things, ends. And then finally, your objectives are the specific realizations of those goals. So you're kind of moving down a certain level of specificity. Now, when we use the language of objectives, we're really thinking of two kinds of objectives. One is largely quantitative, and that's outputs. These are processes that are put in place, products that are realized. How many programs are you offered? An exhibit is produced. How many people come? A specific population of audience, a specific demographic profile is targeted, and so forth. These are specific outputs. These are the most common measurements that we see with things like museum programs, where we take attendance, we see who came, we get a demographic count, or we earn so much money. Secondly, are outcomes or impacts, and these are perhaps the most significant for us as public historians because they tell us what we want people to learn or experience, the kind of impact that we want to have, whether it's short-term or long-term. Outcomes are largely qualitative. That is, they don't necessarily correspond to numbers per se, but they're more about ideas and meaning making. As you generate goals and objectives for your project, specifically for goals, try not to come up with more than 2 or 3. 3 seems to be a kind of magic number, 4 at the most. And then with objectives, keep them, again, 2 to 4 under each goal. Don't make it overly complicated. Now, the other takeaway we have from the Wells reading regarding outcomes or objectives is that we can think of them also, again, at varying levels, right? And I want to draw your attention to the outcomes hierarchy in the Marcella Wells reading on interpretive planning. And here we can see the kinds of outputs and outcomes that you are going to be thinking about in terms of your projects. And I want you to think about outputs and outcomes specifically. At the base, we have the outputs. This is who are the visitors? Why are they coming? Who are they? How many of them come? How many programs do they come to? How many people have you reached? Or how many programs have you offered? Again, this is that kind of quantitative basis that often can be used to describe scope. For instance, like what did you actually do? How many people did you reach? Farther up the hierarchy, we have more qualitative ideas of outcomes. These can be short or long-term, and as I said before, these have to do with the kind of impact that you have on your visitors. How are they changed? What do they experience? What do they learn? Often this is related specifically to learning, things that you want people to understand, especially for educational programs, but it can also be outcomes that you might want to have within people's social interactions, for instance, or even just skills building. So you'll see here on the right what we're looking at. We're looking at intellectual outcomes, emotional outcomes, psychomotor outcomes. This would be really like building skills or engaging in specific interactives. And then social outcomes. And this is often, again, very programmatic. We want people to discuss, collaborate, engage with each other. Something like kitchen conversations would be both social and intellectual in terms of the outcomes that are being realized, and possibly even emotional given how charged the issue of immigration is. This is the most common area of focus when we are starting to determine project goals, because this is really what we're focusing on in terms of learning objectives or experience objectives. And then finally, we have at the top that sweet spot that we all hope for, which is the Tier 4 impacts. These are long-term impacts to individuals or communities where we're actually seeing some sort of larger, subsequent, long-term effect of what we do. So people may come away from a museum or public history experience and then become activists, right? Or community organizations get formed to address a specific issue that was highlighted. And I'll talk about one of these that happened in a project that I did many years ago later on. This is the most elusive kind of outcome, the hardest to measure, But when you do achieve it, it's sweet indeed. Okay, so that's outcomes, outputs, objectives, goals. Again, we can kind of locate these at different levels of specificity and different levels of impact, as well as different kinds of measurement, qualitative and quantitative. Now, one final piece to your project planning is the creation of a logic model. And here we can see in this is the most basic kind of logic model. We see the inputs, that's from the first slide, right? The audience and visitor, stakeholder needs and interests, the resources and collections, the materials, the infrastructure, etc. What are you putting in to your project? And then we see the outcomes and the outputs. In most logic models, outputs are activities and audience. So this would be like, what are the programs that you're offering? Again, what I talked about before, who's coming, who's being reached, etc. And then, of course, outcomes, the results. And here we see exactly the similar language from the outcomes hierarchy, short-term, intermediate, and long-term. For your projects, you're really talking about short-term or possibly intermediate outcomes, and that's fine. I think for most of you, you're really talking about what kind of meaning making do you want to have? What kinds of experiences or meanings do you want to communicate? And those are short-term outcomes, really learning objectives, or what you want people to think about or have an awareness of. Outcomes and outputs are perhaps the most important components of project planning, especially for projects that are seeking funding. Outcomes-based evaluation in its language is still often required or used by many funders, for instance, and it's a language that most planners, board members, and other stakeholders understand. Now, finally, we have the evaluation piece. How do you know that you've realized your goals? And then this is probably the most detailed logic model that I found. You can see that at the bottom we have evaluation. So we have a situation, we have input, output, outcomes, and then we have at the base that level of how do we know that we've done what we said we were going to do, and that's evaluation. Specific tools, collecting of data, analyzing, reporting, etc. We're going to talk about that later in the semester, but it's important that this underlies the whole model because this is how you're going to understand what you're doing. Now let me share with you a few examples of project goals and objectives. The first two are from projects that I directed when I worked at the Balch Institute for Ethnic Studies, and the last is a former capstone project. One project that we did in 2000-2001, so a while ago, was with a collaborative project with African immigrant communities in the Philadelphia area. And this was my first introduction to outcomes-based evaluation, and I used outcomes-based evaluation to determine what the evaluation plan for this project was going to be. So some of this was kind of done at the back end as opposed to the front end, but it's a good model of how to think about a program like this. Now, so here's my mission statement, right? The mission of the Community-Based African Immigrant Project at the Balch is twofold: to facilitate the creation of publicly visible media through which African immigrant communities can represent their culture and experience from their own perspective, and two, to enhance general public understanding of local African immigrant communities, their experiences, and their traditions. Now, this is an interesting mission statement because it is twofold, because this is an example of internal and external mission and goals. Because it was a community-based project, we had specific mission vis-a-vis the community, but also then had a larger public mission. And that's also reflected in the outcomes and outputs that were generated for this project. So we had outcomes for African communities, and we also had outcomes for general audience, and then we had specific outputs for the project. So the outputs here, project planning would feature active involvement for African immigrant community members. So this was a process output. And then a product outputs were exhibit and programs attended by a diverse general audience and educational materials widely distributed in the local school districts. In terms of the dual audience, we had two sets of outcomes. For African communities, we wanted greater public visibility and enhanced self-understanding. This was in part because we knew that a lot of African immigrants from different national origin didn't necessarily know each other And so we wanted to kind of use the project to promote a larger sense of this kind of larger umbrella experience. And then for a general audience, we wanted enhanced sensitivity to the African immigrant experience, enhanced understanding of the diversity of African immigrant traditions and their origins, and then finally, comprehension of the national, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. So both the diverse cultural traditions and their meanings, and then also the diverse national origins. I should add that particularly the outcomes for the general audience around diversity were a direct outcome of some of what we heard from our community advisors in the community, that they wanted to convey the deep diversity of their larger population in Philadelphia. Another project that illustrates the kind of goal formation that I'm talking about is a subsequent project that we did with Latino communities in Philadelphia. And here we had 3 basic goals: to document the histories and contemporary experiences of Latinos from their own perspectives, to enhance general public understanding and education about, and to bring together and link various Latino communities in the area. So here, these are 3 goals. 2 are more interpretive. The third is kind of more in that social realm in terms of encouraging social interaction and collaborative programming across different Latino groups. Within those goals, we again had 2-part project objectives. So for Latino communities, we anticipated outcomes of greater public visibility, enhanced self-understanding, and strengthened networks. And for the general public, enhanced sensitivity to the Latino experience, enhanced understanding of the diversity of Latinos, and enhanced understanding of the history of Latinos specifically in the greater Philadelphia region. These are pretty vague goals, and you probably want to have goals that are a little bit more specific than enhanced sensitivity. These were done, very broadly, but for your goals, you probably want to have also more specific objectives in terms of the messaging that you want people to take away. Here finally is an example of a project that was done by a capstone student a couple of years ago. This was for a podcast about the history of Brer Rabbit that she did for the Wren's Nest. She had 4 basic goals: raise public awareness of Brer Rabbit's origins in the oral tradition of enslaved people, motivate critical thinking about race and cultural appropriation, motivate public consideration of the purposes of Brer Rabbit stories beyond entertainment, and the way in which Brer Rabbit showed up in popular culture, and then raise awareness of and encourage interest in visiting the Wren's Nest. This was obviously a more internal goal for the Wren's Nest, this final goal, but an important one and a reason why they were doing the podcast. So here you can see one of the things that she did really well was she had specific things, thematic things, or specific ideas that she wanted to communicate to the public, and these formed the basis of her goals, particularly with critical thinking and understanding some of the origins of Brer Rabbit. She also did an outcomes hierarchy pyramid for her podcast, and you can see this is something that you can do for your own project. Think about audience data and information and outputs. So here, the podcast will consist of 5 episodes, and the demographics will be varied. Here she was kind of being speculative, which you will also probably be speculative as well in this regard. But she was trying to think about who her audience was. And then the specific outcomes, she had social outcomes, emotional, intellectual. And again, you can think about what are the different ways in which you are having impact on your program participants, your audience, or your stakeholders. So one of the things I want you to do for your own project is to create a logic model. This can be part of your proposal. What are your specific inputs, outputs, objectives? Consider how your project fits into an outcomes hierarchy. You don't have to have all the levels, but you want to know which levels you're reaching. And then how do all of these realize your larger project goals? Final considerations for planning are timeline. In your case, you are outlining specifically your goals have to be time sensitive, right? The T in SMART. You're going to be considering what your timeline is and then outlining a specific work plan. Again, this is related to inputs. What are the specific activities that need to happen in order to realize the project along the way, and when do they need to happen? One thing to think about in formulating your work plan is contingent activities. Sometimes something is contingent on something else having happened before it. For instance, you can't edit and transcribe or excerpt from an oral history if you haven't actually conducted the oral history interview. So that's a good example of contingent activities in your work plan. Another way to construct your work plan is to work backwards from your drop-dead deadline, and then how long is it going to take you to complete each task. So let's say, well, you have to meet with your committee the week before, so you have to do a final draft at a date before then, and work backward to through the different activities and the project draft and your front-end activities. Finally, consider budget. This is less of an issue for you all, but if you were working in any kind of institutional context, I can guarantee you that it would be a major issue. How much do things cost? You may have some budgetary considerations if you're asking organizations to contribute anything, or you need equipment, web hosting, and so forth. I think for all of you, most of this is covered by the university resources, but again, it's always helpful to know what kinds of resources you're going to need going into a project. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is project planning. I hope this is helpful in thinking about how to build out your own project plan and proposal for this semester.